Hello everyone and welcome back to this vlog. I want to talk to you all about light and how it affects how we take our photos. Within photography there is a very well known tool that we use to determine light and how it affects what we do, and that's the exposure triangle. Now it is called the exposure triangle because we're talking about light and exposure, but it's also got 3 points to it, 3 ways that we can alter and use our exposure in order to get the best possible light within the image. And I'd like to talk to you today in this part of the video about aperture and how that works. I'm just going to show you a few sample images on screen as well as talk you through what aperture means. Aperture is very straightforward. It is basically at the front of the lens on the camera there is a hole which allows the light into the camera. Now what that does is it will change size depending on how much light you want to let into the camera. So if I want to let a large amount of light in, I'll have a large aperture, and if I want to only let a small amount of light in, I'll have a small aperture. Now I'm going to show you on screen 3 images that show you how that works in practice. In the first image you can see on screen now, you can see that in the lighter areas there is too much light. I've shot this image with a very wide aperture, the widest I can get on this particular lens, and I'm allowing too much light into the scene, and the result of that is it makes it look as though some of the areas are washed out. We've lost some of the detail and some of the colour, and there's no contrast at all in the image, and that's the result of opening the aperture too wide. I'm going to show you another image now where I've opened the aperture but not wide enough. In this second image that you can see here now, the aperture is too small to allow enough light in, so we get very dark areas, and you can see on that image that there is no detail in the image. We don't pick up very much colour, there's hardly any light, and again there's no contrast or detail that we're trying to make an image out of. In this third image that you can see on screen now, you can see that I have increased the exposure by opening up the aperture slightly, but I haven't opened it up too far. I've just opened it up enough for the exposure to be absolutely correct. And what that does is it allows the right amount of light in, and we get more detail, contrast and colour in the image. And that's aperture, that's how aperture works. So you have 3 separate images there, where one image is way too light because the aperture is far too wide, an image which is way too dark because the aperture is not wide enough, and an image which is just right because the aperture is just in the right place. It's a medium aperture. But aperture also has another effect as well, and I'd like to show you that as well now. Aperture will also determine depth of field. Now what depth of field is, put quite simply, is the area in the photo which is in focus and the areas which are out of focus. If we have a very wide aperture, the widest we can go, therefore letting in the most amount of light, what will happen is we will also have a very narrow depth of field. So if I want to focus on something, say 6 feet in front of the camera, then the only thing that will be in focus will be that subject 6 feet in front of the camera. Anything which is further back from that, as you start to move further back, it starts to drop out of focus. So the background will be blurred and soft focus, and we won't get a very sharp image, although the subject at the front of the image will be in sharp focus. Now that's okay if that's what you want, but if you wanted to have everything in focus, you would have to then shut down your aperture to a very, very narrow aperture and shoot with the narrowest aperture possible, and that would give you a larger depth of field, and that would mean that there would be more of the image from front to back actually in focus when you take the shot. And here are 2 examples now on screen. In the first image you can see I've shot with a very wide aperture, and in this instance my focus is in the centre of the image, and you'll notice that the centre of the image is fully in focus. That's very sharp, but as you move out towards the edge of the images it becomes softer and softer and softer in the focus the further away from the centre of the image you get. In the second image you get exactly the same effect, but it's very slightly different. As you move further out to the edges of the images you'll find that the focus is still quite sharp the further and further out you get compared to the first image. Now the reason for that is I've shot that with a very narrow aperture, so I'm not letting in very much light, but it gives me a much larger depth of field, so it allows more of the image to be in focus as I shoot that image, and it is very noticeable on these two images. So that's aperture. In part 2 I'm going to tell you all about shutter speed and how that works.